Carl Rogers fundamentally altered how we understand the human mind and psychological healing. He proposed that people already possess within themselves the wisdom needed for their own growth. This was not merely a therapeutic technique, but a complete inversion of psychological authority. Before Rogers, therapists functioned as experts who diagnosed problems and prescribed solutions to passive patients. Rogers declared that the client, not the clinician, is the true expert on their own life. This single assertion disrupted decades of psychiatric and psychoanalytic practice in the 20th century. His work emerged from concrete clinical experience, not abstract theorizing disconnected from real human struggle. Rogers built his theory from thousands of hours sitting with troubled children and distressed adults. He discovered that his academic training often failed when confronted with actual human suffering. The theories he had memorized did not hold up against the test of lived reality. So he began listening more carefully to what his clients were actually telling him. What he heard changed psychology forever. People heal when they feel genuinely understood and accepted. Rogers was the first major psychologist to subject therapy itself to rigorous empirical testing. He recorded sessions, analyzed transcripts, and measured outcomes with scientific precision. This made his work simultaneously revolutionary in content and conservative in method. He demanded evidence for claims that other psychologists simply assumed to be true. His research demonstrated that the therapeutic relationship itself, not specific techniques, produces psychological change. The quality of human connection matters more than the sophistication of any intervention. His influence extends far beyond the therapy room into education, business, and conflict resolution. Self-determination theory, motivational interviewing, and student-centered learning all trace their roots to his ideas. Yet Rogers remains widely misunderstood, his theory often reduced to simplistic caricatures. Many believe he merely advocated being nice to clients and reflecting their words back to them. This fundamentally misses the depth and precision of his theoretical framework. What follows is an attempt to present the complete architecture of his thought with clarity and rigor. Part 1. The Actualizing Tendency and the Foundation of Human Nature. Rogers placed a single biological claim at the center of his entire psychological system. Every living organism possesses an inherent drive toward growth, maintenance, and self-enhancement. He called this the actualizing tendency, and it represents his foundational assumption about human nature. This is not merely a philosophical preference, but a statement about biological reality. Life itself tends toward greater complexity, organization, and the realization of latent capacities. A seed becomes a tree, not because something external compels it, but because growth is its nature. Rogers extended this biological principle from simple organisms to human psychological development. He observed that damaged potato sprouts in a basement still stretch toward any available light. These plants cannot thrive, but they continue attempting to actualize whatever growth remains possible. Humans operate the same way, Rogers argued, even under deeply unfavorable psychological conditions. The drive toward becoming more fully oneself persists regardless of how distorted the environment. This is not optimism or wishful thinking, but an observation about how organisms actually function. The actualizing tendency was not original to Rogers. Kurt Goldstein, a German neurologist, first introduced the concept in his 1934 book titled The Organism. Goldstein observed brain-injured soldiers and noticed their persistent efforts to restore function and meaning. Even with severe neurological damage, these patients kept striving to reorganize their capacities. Abraham Maslow later adopted the term but attached different conditions and requirements to it. Maslow believed only about 1% of people ever achieve genuine self-actualization. Rogers disagreed sharply with Maslow on this critical point. For Rogers, the actualizing tendency operates continuously in all living beings without exception. It is not a final destination that few reach, but an ongoing process that everyone experiences. The question is never whether someone has this tendency, but whether conditions support or block it. A plant in darkness does not lack the tendency to grow. It lacks the light required for growth. Similarly, humans do not lack the capacity for psychological development. They lack the right environment. This distinction carries profound implications for understanding psychological disturbance and health. Traditional psychiatry located the source of mental illness inside the individual patient. The problem was a defective psyche, a chemical imbalance, or a damaged developmental history. Rogers shifted the focus from internal pathology to the quality of the surrounding social environment. People do not become psychologically disturbed because they are fundamentally broken or deficient. They become disturbed because their environment failed to provide what they needed for natural growth. The implications here are genuinely radical and often underappreciated. If the actualizing tendency is universal and inherent, then no external expert can know better than the individual. The organism itself possesses a kind of wisdom about what it needs for its own development. This directly challenges the authority structure of traditional medicine and psychiatry. Rogers was not merely suggesting a gentler bedside manner for therapists. He was questioning whether therapists should function as authorities at all. Rogers later expanded the actualizing tendency into an even broader principle he called the formative tendency. This is the predisposition of all matter to organize into increasingly complex and integrated structures. From atoms forming molecules to galaxies emerging from cosmic dust, nature moves toward complexity. Living organisms represent a special case of this universal tendency toward organization and integration. Human consciousness represents an even more developed expression of the same underlying cosmic principle. Rogers saw psychological growth as continuous with the fundamental creative direction of the universe itself. This cosmological extension might seem speculative, but Rogers grounded it in observable phenomena. He pointed to the spontaneous self-organization visible at every level of physical and biological systems. Crystals form regular lattice structures without any external designer arranging their components. Embryos develop into complex organisms following an internal program encoded in their biology. Human beings, Rogers argued, follow the same pattern at the psychological level of development. Given appropriate conditions, they naturally move toward integration, wholeness, and fuller functioning. Neuroscience has since provided some support for claims that resemble the actualizing tendency. Research on the default mode network reveals that brains spontaneously engage in self-referential processing. Studies using brain imaging show that self-actualized individuals display greater connectivity between neural regions. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for integration and self-awareness, activates during states of psychological coherence. People who report higher well-being show more unified patterns of brain activity during rest. The brain appears to seek integration and coherence, much as Rogers suggested the whole organism does. However, the actualizing tendency contains a tension that Rogers himself acknowledged over time. His early formulation in 1951 presented self-actualization as necessarily optimal and growth-promoting. But in his more developed 1959 theory, he recognized that self-actualization could conflict with flourishing. The self-concept, once formed, seeks to maintain and actualize itself even when distorted. A person who has learned to see themselves as worthless will actualize that self-image consistently. This creates a tragic possibility. The actualizing tendency can perpetuate the very patterns that cause suffering. This tension requires distinguishing between the actualizing tendency of the whole organism and the self-concept. The organism as a whole tends toward growth, health, and the full development of its potentials. But the self-concept is a learned structure that may not accurately represent the organism's actual experience. When the self-concept becomes rigid and defensive, it blocks the natural flow of organismic experiencing. The person then actualizes a false self rather than the authentic directions of their deeper nature. This is why Rogers believed therapy must work with the whole person, not just their conscious self-image. Critics have challenged whether the actualizing tendency can account for genuinely destructive human behavior. If all organisms naturally tend toward growth and enhancement, how do we explain cruelty and violence? Rogers maintained that destructive behavior results from distorted development, not from inherent human evil. When the environment consistently blocks or thwarts the actualizing tendency, pathology emerges. The violence is defensive, compensatory, or symptomatic of unmet needs, not evidence of innate badness. Remove the distorting conditions, Rogers believed, and the natural tendency toward prosocial behavior returns. This view has been criticized as naive about human nature, particularly by those with theological commitments. Some argue that Rogers ignores the reality of genuine moral evil and human capacity for sin. Others suggest his view reflects a particular cultural optimism characteristic of American progressive thought. The philosopher Rollo May directly challenged Rogers on this point in their famous exchange about evil. May argued that Rogers underestimated the demonic potential residing within every human being. Rogers responded that May was confusing distortion from environmental damage with inherent destructive drives. The debate remains unresolved, but Rogers' position deserves more careful consideration than it typically receives. He was not claiming that humans are always good or that they never cause terrible harm. He was claiming that the fundamental directional tendency of the organism is toward constructive development. Destructiveness emerges when this natural tendency is frustrated, suppressed, or chronically thwarted. The evidence from developmental psychology generally supports this view of aggression and antisocial behavior. Children raised in secure, supportive environments consistently show less aggression than those raised in neglect. Understanding the actualizing tendency properly is essential because everything else in Rogers' system depends on it. If you reject this premise, the rest of his theory loses its logical coherence and practical justification. If you accept it, then the role of therapy, education, and relationships fundamentally changes. The task is no longer to fix broken people through expert intervention and technical procedure. The task becomes creating conditions that allow natural healing and growth to occur spontaneously. This shifts power from the helper to the person being helped in a profound and systematic way. Part 2. The self-concept, incongruence, and the architecture of psychological disturbance. Rogers constructed a precise theory of personality built around the concept of self. The self is not a static entity, but a fluid, organized pattern of perceptions about who one is. It includes all the beliefs, evaluations, and images a person holds about their own being. This self-concept forms gradually through experience and interaction with significant others in early life. It becomes the lens through which all subsequent experience is filtered and interpreted. Once established, the self-concept exerts powerful influence over what a person can perceive and accept. Rogers distinguished between the self-concept and what he called the organismic experience. The organism continuously generates a flow of sensations, feelings, and perceptions from moment to moment. This organismic experiencing is immediate, bodily, and exists prior to any conscious interpretation. It represents the raw data of lived experience before the mind categorizes or judges it. The self-concept, by contrast, is a cognitive structure built from accumulated beliefs about oneself. Healthy functioning requires that the self-concept accurately represents and includes organismic experience. The central problem in psychological disturbance is what Rogers termed incongruence. Incongruence occurs when a gap opens between organismic experience and the self-concept. The person feels something at a deep bodily level but cannot admit it into conscious awareness. The experience conflicts with their established image of who they believe themselves to be. So the experience gets denied, distorted, or pushed outside the boundaries of acceptable self-perception. This creates internal division, tension, and the foundation for psychological symptoms and suffering. Consider a concrete example to clarify how incongruence develops and operates. A child feels genuine anger toward a parent who has treated them unfairly or harshly. But the child has learned that good children do not feel anger toward their loving parents. The anger is real at the organismic level. The child's body registers it unmistakably. Yet admitting this anger would threaten the child's self-concept as good and lovable. So the anger gets denied or transformed into something more acceptable, like guilt or sadness. The denied experience does not disappear simply because it has been excluded from awareness. It continues to influence behavior and generate symptoms even while remaining unconscious. The person may experience vague anxiety without knowing its source or meaning. They may develop physical symptoms, rigid defenses, or patterns of avoidance and withdrawal. The energy required to maintain the denial drains resources from living fully and freely. Psychological symptoms are therefore signals that important experience is being blocked from integration. Rogers identified the origin of incongruence in what he called conditions of worth. These are the requirements a child learns they must meet to receive love and acceptance. Parents and caregivers inevitably communicate that some feelings and behaviors are acceptable while others are not. The child desperately needs the positive regard of those on whom their survival depends. So they begin suppressing experiences that threaten the supply of love and approval. The self-concept forms around what is acceptable rather than around what is actually experienced. Conditions of worth become internalized and operate automatically throughout adult life. The person no longer needs external figures to enforce the conditions. They enforce them internally. They feel shame, guilt, or anxiety whenever forbidden experiences begin to surface. The internal critic attacks any deviation from the learned standards of acceptability. This creates a profound disconnection between who the person truly is and who they believe they must be. The authentic self gets buried under layers of defensive self-presentation and learned performance. Rogers contrasted conditions of worth with what he called unconditional positive regard. This is acceptance and valuing of a person that does not depend on their meeting specific conditions. When children receive unconditional positive regard, they do not need to deny their experience. All their feelings remain acceptable even if certain behaviors require guidance and limits. The child can integrate anger, fear, sexuality, and vulnerability into their developing self-concept. They grow up with a self-structure that accurately reflects and includes their organismic experiencing. The distinction between conditional and unconditional regard is subtle but critical. Unconditional positive regard does not mean approving of all behaviors or having no boundaries. It means that the person's fundamental worth is never contingent on performance or compliance. A parent can set firm limits on behavior while still communicating complete acceptance of the child. The child learns that their actions have consequences without learning that they are fundamentally unlovable. The self-concept can then develop with flexibility and openness to ongoing experience. Rogers proposed that the degree of incongruence determines the severity of psychological disturbance. Mild incongruence produces ordinary neurotic symptoms like anxiety, depression, and relationship difficulties. More severe incongruence can fragment the self-concept and produce dissociation or psychotic breaks. When too much experience must be denied, the defensive structure eventually becomes overwhelmed. The person can no longer maintain the rigid boundary between acceptable and forbidden experience. Reality breaks through the defenses in chaotic and disorganizing ways that we label as mental illness. This framework explains psychological disturbance without invoking disease categories or diagnostic labels. Rogers actively resisted the medical model that dominated psychiatry and clinical psychology. He believed that diagnostic categories distract from understanding the unique experience of each individual. Labels like schizophrenia or borderline personality disorder tell us nothing about the person's actual life. They create an illusion of understanding while actually preventing genuine contact and comprehension. Rogers wanted therapists to abandon the diagnostic stance entirely and meet each person as unique. The self-concept contains not only current self-perceptions, but also an ideal self. This is the image of who the person believes they should or would like to become. Psychological health involves reasonable alignment between the perceived self and the ideal self. Too large a gap produces chronic dissatisfaction, self-criticism, and feelings of inadequacy. But the ideal self must also remain flexible and responsive to actual organismic experience. A rigid, perfectionistic ideal self can become another source of conditions of worth. Rogers' theory of the self drew from multiple intellectual traditions that converged in his thinking. Phenomenological philosophy emphasized the primacy of subjective experience and first-person perspective. The organism does not respond to objective reality, but to reality as perceived and experienced. This means that understanding any person requires entering their internal frame of reference. What matters is not what actually happened, but what the person believes and feels happened. The phenomenological field, as Rogers called it, is the true domain of psychological inquiry. This phenomenological stance has profound implications for the practice of therapy. The therapist cannot assume they know what the client's experience means or should mean. They must bracket their own assumptions and genuinely attempt to see from the client's perspective. Any interpretation imposed from outside violates the client's authority over their own experience. The therapist's job is not to explain, but to understand, not to correct, but to accompany. This requires a radical humility that contradicts the traditional expert role of the clinician. The self-concept functions both to organize experience and to defend against threatening perceptions. Rogers identified two primary defensive operations: denial and distortion. Denial involves completely blocking threatening experience from entering conscious awareness. The person simply does not perceive what would be too destabilizing to their self-structure. Distortion involves allowing the experience into awareness, but altering it to fit the self-concept. Anger becomes righteousness, desire becomes duty, and vulnerability becomes intellectual analysis. These defenses operate automatically and unconsciously to protect the integrity of the self-concept. The person does not choose to deny or distort. It happens before conscious awareness engages. This is why simply telling someone what they are really feeling rarely produces lasting change. The defenses must be dissolved gradually through experiencing a different kind of relationship. Only in an atmosphere of safety and acceptance can the denied material slowly surface. The therapeutic relationship provides the conditions that were missing in the original development. Rogers believed that beneath all the defensive distortions lies an authentic organismic self. This deeper self knows what it genuinely feels, wants, and needs for its own flourishing. It possesses what Rogers called organismic valuing, an inherent wisdom about what enhances life. When defenses relax and incongruence decreases, this organismic wisdom becomes increasingly accessible. The person begins trusting their own experience rather than external authorities and imposed standards. They become, in Rogers's famous phrase, the person they truly are, rather than what others expect. Part 3. The 6 necessary and sufficient conditions for therapeutic change. Rogers made a bold claim that distinguished his approach from all other therapeutic systems. He identified 6 conditions that he argued were necessary and sufficient for therapeutic personality change. Necessary means that without these conditions, constructive change simply will not occur. Sufficient means that when these conditions are present, change will inevitably follow. No other technique, interpretation, or intervention is required beyond establishing these conditions. This was a direct challenge to therapies built on specialized methods and expert knowledge. The claim appears in his landmark 1957 paper, one of the most cited articles in psychotherapy history. Rogers stated these conditions with scientific precision, intending them as testable hypotheses. He wanted his theory to rise or fall based on empirical evidence, not on authority or tradition. The conditions were meant to apply across all types of clients and all therapeutic orientations. If true, they would explain why therapy works when it does, regardless of the method employed. They would reveal that the relationship itself, not the technique, produces psychological healing. The first condition is that 2 persons must be in psychological contact. This means that each must make some perceived difference in the experiential field of the other. Without this basic contact, nothing therapeutic can occur, because there is no real relationship. This condition seems obvious, but establishes that therapy requires genuine human connection. The client must matter to the therapist, and the therapist must register as present to the client. Mechanical or purely technical interactions fail this fundamental precondition for change. The second condition concerns the client's internal state at the beginning of therapy. The client must be in a state of incongruence, experiencing some vulnerability or anxiety. If there is no incongruence, there is nothing to heal and no motivation for therapeutic work. The client comes to therapy because something in their experience does not fit their self-concept. This discrepancy creates the discomfort that makes them open to a different kind of relationship. The incongruence is not pathology, but the starting point that makes growth possible. The third condition requires that the therapist be congruent within the therapeutic relationship. Congruence means that the therapist's inner experience matches their outward expression and communication. The therapist is genuine, integrated, and not hiding behind a professional facade or role. Their feelings are available to awareness and can be appropriately communicated when relevant. This does not mean therapists share everything they feel or use sessions for self-expression. It means they are real persons present in the relationship, not actors playing a therapeutic part. The fourth condition is that the therapist experiences unconditional positive regard for the client. This means accepting the client as they are without conditions, judgment, or requirements for change. The therapist prizes the client as a person of inherent worth, regardless of their behaviors or feelings. This acceptance extends to all aspects of the client's experience, including what the client rejects in themselves. The therapist does not need the client to be different in order to value and care about them. This creates safety for the client to begin accepting their own denied and distorted experiences. The fifth condition requires that the therapist experiences empathic understanding of the client's internal frame. The therapist senses the client's private world as if it were their own, without losing the as-if quality. This is not sympathy, which involves feeling sorry for someone from an external position. Empathy means temporarily entering the client's subjective reality and perceiving from within it. The therapist grasps not just the content, but the felt meaning of the client's experience. They understand why the client sees the world as they do, even when that view seems distorted. The sixth condition closes the loop between therapist and client experience. The client must perceive, at least to a minimal degree, the therapist's unconditional regard and empathy. It is not enough for the therapist to feel these attitudes. They must be communicated effectively. The client must actually receive and register the acceptance and understanding being offered. Without this perception, the therapeutic conditions remain merely in the therapist's experience. The client must feel understood and accepted, not merely be in the presence of someone who understands. Rogers emphasized that these 6 conditions constitute a unified gestalt, not a checklist of separate items. Each condition interlocks with the others to create a total therapeutic environment. You cannot have genuine empathy without unconditional regard, because judgment blocks understanding. You cannot offer unconditional regard without congruence, because pretended acceptance rings false. The conditions must be present simultaneously and continuously throughout the therapeutic relationship. Their combined presence creates the climate in which the actualizing tendency can operate freely. The claim that these conditions are sufficient generated enormous controversy and continues to be debated. Many therapists accept that the conditions are necessary, but argue they are not sufficient. They believe additional techniques, interpretations, or structured interventions are also required. Cognitive behavioral therapists argue that specific skill training produces changes beyond relationship effects. Psychodynamic therapists maintain that interpretation of unconscious material adds something essential. Rogers responded that what these additions actually provide is more of the core conditions. Rogers argued that techniques work not because of their specific content, but because they communicate the conditions. A cognitive behavioral intervention communicates that the therapist is engaged and trying to help. A psychodynamic interpretation can convey deep understanding of the client's inner conflicts. What appears to be technique is actually a vehicle for empathy, regard, and genuine presence. Strip away the relationship elements, and the techniques lose their therapeutic power entirely. Research on therapy outcomes has consistently supported the primacy of relationship factors. The necessity claim has received stronger empirical support than the sufficiency claim. Decades of research confirm that empathy, regard, and congruence predict positive therapy outcomes. These findings hold across different therapeutic orientations and different types of psychological problems. Therapists who score higher on these dimensions consistently produce better results with their clients. Clients who perceive their therapists as empathic and accepting improve more than those who do not. The evidence for the importance of these conditions is among the most robust in psychotherapy research. However, the sufficiency claim remains more contested and difficult to test definitively. Some studies suggest that person-centered therapy performs less well than structured approaches for certain conditions. Cognitive behavioral therapy appears more effective for specific anxiety disorders and obsessive-compulsive symptoms. But defenders of Rogers note that many comparison studies use watered-down versions of person-centered therapy. They argue that therapists in these studies often lack adequate training in providing the core conditions. The debate continues because measuring the actual presence of these conditions remains methodologically challenging. Rogers himself acknowledged that providing these conditions is far more difficult than it might appear. Genuine, unconditional positive regard is rare even among trained therapists claiming to offer it. Deep empathy requires sustained effort and a willingness to set aside one's own perspective. Congruence demands ongoing self-awareness and the courage to be authentic in relationships. Most therapists provide these conditions inconsistently, partially, or only in diluted forms. The full presence of all 6 conditions may be an ideal that is approximated rather than achieved. This recognition led Rogers to describe the conditions as existing on a continuum rather than as absolutes. The therapeutic question is not whether the conditions are present or absent entirely. The question is whether they are present to a degree sufficient to facilitate therapeutic movement. More of the conditions generally produces more change, up to some optimal level. This formulation allows for the reality that perfect empathy and unconditional regard are humanly impossible. The therapist need not be perfectly congruent, but congruent enough to establish genuine contact. Part 4. Deep analysis of the core conditions: empathy, unconditional positive regard, and congruence. Empathy is the most frequently discussed of Rogers's core conditions, yet remains widely misunderstood. Popular conceptions reduce empathy to feeling sorry for someone, or imagining oneself in their situation. Rogers meant something more precise and more demanding than these common usages suggest. Empathic understanding involves sensing the client's inner world with accuracy and sensitivity. The therapist perceives the client's feelings and meanings as if from within the client's frame of reference. But the as-if quality is essential. The therapist never loses awareness that this is another's experience. Rogers described empathy as an active, ongoing process rather than a static state of understanding. The therapist continuously checks their perception against the client's actual experience and communication. They offer tentative understandings that invite correction and further elaboration from the client. This creates a collaborative exploration where the client feels accompanied rather than analyzed. The therapist is not the expert who knows what the client really means beneath their words. The therapist is a companion who helps the client discover and articulate their own meanings. Neuroscience research has begun illuminating the biological substrates of empathic processes. Studies identify distinct neural systems involved in affective empathy and cognitive perspective taking. Affective empathy involves resonating emotionally with another person's felt experience. Cognitive empathy involves understanding another's mental states through inference and imagination. Roger's empathy appears to require both capacities working together in integrated fashion. The therapist must both feel with the client and understand the cognitive structure of their experience. Mirror neurons, discovered in the 1990s, were initially thought to provide a biological basis for empathy. These neurons fire both when performing an action and when observing someone else perform it. Early enthusiasm suggested they might explain how we automatically understand others' intentions and feelings. Subsequent research has complicated this picture and reduced confidence in simple mirror neuron explanations. Empathy appears to involve multiple brain systems working together in complex coordination. The neuroscience validates that empathy is real and measurable without reducing it to a single mechanism. Rogers emphasized that empathy must be communicated, not merely felt internally by the therapist. The client must actually perceive and receive the therapist's empathic understanding for it to be therapeutic. This requires skill in finding words that accurately capture the client's experience. The therapist's reflections must feel right to the client, matching their inner sense of things. When the reflection misses, the client feels misunderstood and may withdraw or correct. When the reflection lands accurately, something shifts and deepens in the therapeutic relationship. Unconditional positive regard has generated more controversy than any other Rogerian concept. Critics argue that it is impossible to genuinely accept behaviors that are harmful or destructive. How can a therapist offer unconditional regard to someone who abuses children or commits violence? Rogers's response distinguished between the person and their behaviors with careful precision. Unconditional positive regard is directed at the person's inherent worth, not their specific actions. You can fully accept a human being while still having serious concerns about what they have done. The conditionality in question concerns the person's fundamental value and right to exist. Unconditional positive regard means the client does not have to earn the therapist's respect or caring. They are valued simply because they are a human being with inherent dignity and worth. This does not require the therapist to approve of everything the client does or believes. It requires that disapproval of specific behaviors not translate into rejection of the whole person. The client can be held accountable while still being regarded with genuine warmth and acceptance. Rogers acknowledged that unconditional positive regard is an ideal that no therapist achieves perfectly. Every therapist has reactions, judgments, and limits on what they can genuinely accept. The goal is to maximize unconditional acceptance while honestly acknowledging one's real limitations. A therapist who pretends to feel acceptance they do not actually have fails the congruence condition. Better to acknowledge one's difficulty accepting something than to offer false or forced acceptance. Genuine but limited regard is more therapeutic than comprehensive but inauthentic regard. The concept of unconditional positive regard connects to research on attachment theory. Secure attachment in infancy develops when caregivers provide consistent, accepting responsiveness. The child learns that they are valued and that their needs will be met reliably. This creates an internal working model of self as worthy and others as trustworthy. Insecure attachment results when care is inconsistent, conditional, or rejecting. Therapy may function as a corrective attachment experience that repairs these early deficits. Congruence is the condition Rogers considered most fundamental, yet most easily misunderstood. It does not mean the therapist shares all their feelings or makes themselves the focus of sessions. Congruence means the therapist is genuine, integrated, and present as a real human being. Their inner experience matches their outer expression. They are not playing a therapeutic role. What they communicate to the client reflects what they actually feel and perceive. This authenticity creates the trust that makes the other conditions possible and believable. Rogers was clear that congruence does not require constant self-disclosure or emotional transparency. The therapist's feelings are available to their own awareness and can be communicated when appropriate. But the criterion for sharing is whether disclosure serves the client's therapeutic process. Sharing personal reactions must facilitate the client's exploration, not satisfy the therapist's needs. The therapist exercises judgment about what and when to communicate from their experience. Congruence is about being real, not about being exhibitionistic or inappropriately self-focused. The relationship among the three core conditions forms an interconnected system. Congruence is foundational because without it, empathy and positive regard cannot be genuine. A therapist who offers acceptance they do not really feel communicates falseness that clients detect. Empathy offered without genuine regard becomes cold analysis rather than warm understanding. Positive regard without empathy becomes abstract acceptance that does not really know what it accepts. All three conditions must be present together for the therapeutic relationship to have its full effect. Rogers believed these conditions apply to all growth-promoting relationships, not just therapy. Teachers who offer empathy, acceptance, and genuineness create classrooms where students flourish. Parents who provide these conditions raise children with secure attachment and healthy self-concepts. Leaders who embody these attitudes create organizations where people do their best work. The conditions describe what humans need from relationships in order to grow and develop. Therapy is simply a specialized context for providing what all helping relationships require. Research has extensively investigated these conditions using various measurement approaches. The Barrett-Leonard Relationship Inventory, developed in 1962, remains a standard assessment instrument. It measures client perceptions of therapist empathy, regard, congruence, and unconditionality. Studies consistently find that these perceived conditions predict positive therapeutic outcomes. The measures have been adapted for use in educational and organizational contexts as well. The evidence supports Rogers' claim that these conditions matter across different types of relationships. One crucial finding is that client perception of the conditions matters more than objective ratings. What the client experiences as empathy predicts outcomes better than what observers rate as empathic. This aligns with Rogers' phenomenological emphasis on the primacy of subjective experience. It also suggests that therapists must learn to communicate their attitudes in ways clients can receive. Technical competence in empathic responding may matter less than the client feeling genuinely understood. The relationship exists in the space between two subjectivities, not in observable behavioral techniques. Part 5. Intellectual Influences and Historical Development, Otto Rank, John Dewey, Jesse Taft, and Phenomenology. Rogers did not create his theory from nothing. He synthesized influences from diverse intellectual sources. Understanding these influences reveals the deeper foundations beneath his therapeutic innovations. His thought drew from post-Freudian psychoanalysis, American pragmatism, and phenomenological philosophy. Each tradition contributed elements that Rogers integrated into his distinctive approach. Tracing these influences illuminates both the originality and the intellectual depths of his work. No thinker emerges fully formed. All build on what came before while adding something new. Otto Rank stands as perhaps the most significant direct influence on Rogers's therapeutic practice. Rank was a psychoanalyst who broke from Freud and developed his own approach called will therapy. He emphasized the client's present experience and creative will rather than excavating the past. Rank believed that the therapeutic relationship itself, not insight into history, produces change. He valued the client's autonomy and self-determination over the analyst's interpretive authority. These emphases directly anticipate the core features of what Rogers would later develop. Rogers encountered Rank's ideas not through Rank himself, but through his students and followers. Jesse Taft, a social worker trained by Rank, worked at the same Rochester clinic as Rogers. Taft had translated Rank's works from German and developed relationship therapy based on his principles. She emphasized meeting clients in the present moment and trusting their capacity for self-direction. Her approach focused on the quality of the therapeutic relationship rather than on technique. Rogers absorbed these ideas through daily contact with clinicians trained in Rankian methods. Taft's influence deserves particular recognition because she was among the first to articulate relationship-based therapy. She argued that the therapeutic relationship provides a corrective emotional experience. The client encounters a different kind of relating than what caused their original difficulties. Through this new relationship, they can develop new capacities for authentic living. Taft's feminism also shaped her approach. She resisted the authoritarian dynamics of orthodox psychoanalysis. Her emphasis on mutuality and respect in the therapeutic relationship prefigured Rogers's egalitarian stance. Frederick Allen, another Rankian social worker, also influenced Rogers during his Rochester years. Allen worked with children and emphasized respecting the child's own growth impulses. He believed therapists should follow the child's lead rather than impose adult interpretations. This non-directive stance with children directly anticipated Rogers's later work with adults. Allen trusted that given the right conditions, children would move toward health spontaneously. Rogers generalized this trust in natural development to his understanding of all human beings. John Dewey's pragmatist philosophy provided another crucial strand in Rogers's intellectual formation. Rogers encountered Dewey's ideas at Teachers College of Columbia University during his graduate training. William Hurd Kilpatrick, a student of Dewey, taught courses that profoundly affected Rogers's thinking. Dewey emphasized experience as the foundation of knowledge and the medium of education. He rejected abstract theorizing, divorced from practical consequences and lived realities. This pragmatic orientation shaped Rogers' insistence that theory must arise from and serve practice. Dewey's educational philosophy particularly influenced Rogers's later work on student-centered learning. Dewey argued that education should begin with the learner's own interests and experiences. The teacher's role is not to transmit information, but to facilitate the student's own inquiry. Learning occurs through active engagement with problems that matter to the learner. Rogers directly translated these principles into his approach to classroom teaching. His book, Freedom to Learn, applied person-centered principles to educational settings explicitly. Dewey also contributed the concept of the organism as a unified whole, interacting with its environment. He rejected mind-body dualism and viewed humans as integrated biological and psychological beings. The organism does not passively receive environmental stimuli, but actively engages and transforms experience. This organismic holism became central to Rogers' theory of personality and therapeutic change. Rogers's actualizing tendency owes much to Dewey's vision of life as active and growth-oriented. Both thinkers saw humans as fundamentally creative beings, not reactive mechanisms. Phenomenological philosophy provided the epistemological framework for Rogers's emphasis on subjective experience. Phenomenology, founded by Edmund Husserl, made the study of consciousness and lived experience primary. It bracketed questions about objective reality to focus on how reality appears to experiencing subjects. Rogers applied this phenomenological stance to his understanding of clients and therapy. What matters is not objective facts about the client's life, but how they experience and perceive. The internal frame of reference, the client's own subjective world, is the proper domain of therapy. Rogers did not read Husserl directly, but absorbed phenomenological ideas through American psychology. Combs and Snig's 1949 book on perceptual psychology presented a phenomenological approach Rogers found useful. They argued that behavior is determined by the individual's perceptual field, not objective stimuli. To understand anyone, you must grasp how they perceive themselves and their situation. Rogers adopted this perceptual orientation and made it central to his theory of personality. His 19 propositions about personality all emphasize the phenomenological field as primary. Existentialist themes also entered Rogers's thinking, though he never fully identified as an existentialist. Søren Kierkegaard's emphasis on individual choice and authentic existence resonated with Rogers's values. The existentialist focus on freedom, responsibility, and becoming oneself aligned with his therapeutic goals. However, Rogers rejected the darker existentialist emphasis on anxiety, absurdity, and despair. He maintained an optimistic view of human nature that contrasted with Jean-Paul Sartre's bleaker vision. Rogers found existentialism valuable, but transformed it through his belief in inherent human goodness. Martin Buber's philosophy of dialogue influenced Rogers' understanding of the therapeutic relationship. Buber distinguished between I-it relationships, which treat others as objects, and I-thou relationships. I-thou relating involves genuine meeting between two subjects who recognize each other's full humanity. Rogers saw the therapeutic relationship as ideally an I-thou encounter of authentic presence. The famous film dialogue between Rogers and Buber explored their agreements and differences. Both valued genuine meeting, but Buber questioned whether therapy could achieve true mutuality. Rogers's theory evolved significantly over his long career, not remaining static after its initial formulation. His early work emphasized non-directive technique, particularly the method of reflection. He later shifted emphasis to the therapist's attitudes, recognizing that technique alone was insufficient. The name change from non-directive to client-centered and finally to person-centered mark this evolution. Each revision reflected deeper understanding of what actually produces therapeutic change. Rogers continuously refined his ideas based on clinical experience and empirical research findings. The historical development shows Rogers integrating streams that had not previously been combined. He brought together relationship emphasis from Rank with scientific rigor from American psychology. He merged phenomenological respect for subjectivity with pragmatic concern for practical effectiveness. He united existentialist themes of freedom with optimistic belief in human potential. This creative synthesis produced something genuinely new, not merely a repetition of prior ideas. Rogers transformed his influences into a coherent and original approach to understanding persons. Part 6. The fully functioning person. Rogers's vision of psychological health. Rogers did not only theorize about psychological disturbance, he articulated a positive vision of health. He described what he called the fully functioning person as the direction of healthy development. This concept represents the outcome when the actualizing tendency operates without distortion or blockage. The fully functioning person is not a fixed state, but an ongoing process of becoming. It describes a quality of living rather than a destination at which one finally arrives. Rogers emphasized that no one fully achieves this ideal. It remains a direction for movement. The first characteristic of fully functioning persons is openness to experience. They do not need to defend against threatening feelings or perceptions by denial or distortion. All experience can enter awareness and be processed accurately without defensive filtering. This includes both positive and negative emotions, both pleasant and painful perceptions. The fully functioning person can acknowledge anger, fear, vulnerability and desire without suppression. Their self-concept is flexible enough to accommodate whatever experience actually occurs. Openness to experience requires that the person has minimal conditions of worth operating internally. They do not need to reject parts of themselves to maintain self-esteem or gain approval. Having received sufficient unconditional positive regard, they can accept themselves as they are. This acceptance extends to feelings and impulses that others might judge as shameful or unacceptable. The fully functioning person does not split themselves into acceptable and unacceptable parts. They live as integrated wholes with access to the full range of their organismic experiencing. The second characteristic is existential living, a way of being fully present in the current moment. The fully functioning person does not live primarily in memories of the past or fantasies of the future. Each moment is experienced freshly without imposing rigid expectations from previous experience. This does not mean ignoring the past or failing to plan. It means not being trapped by them. The person engages flexibly with each new situation rather than responding from fixed patterns. Life becomes an ongoing process of discovery rather than a repetition of established routines. Existential living connects Rogers to themes prominent in existentialist philosophy and Eastern thought. The emphasis on present-moment awareness resembles mindfulness concepts from Buddhist traditions. Rogers never explicitly drew these connections, but later thinkers have noted the parallels. Both traditions value direct experience over conceptual abstraction and present engagement over mental time travel. Contemporary mindfulness-based therapies share significant common ground with person-centered principles. The convergence suggests these may be universal features of psychological health across traditions. The third characteristic is what Rogers called organismic trusting. The fully functioning person trusts their own inner experience as a reliable guide for behavior. When facing decisions, they consult their organismic valuing rather than external authorities or rules. They have learned that their feelings provide valid information about what is right for them. This trust does not mean ignoring rational thought, but integrating it with felt sense. The whole organism, not just the intellect, participates in navigating life situations. Organismic trusting depends on the reconnection of awareness with genuine experience. Through therapy or fortunate life circumstances, the person has resolved major incongruences. Their self-concept now accurately represents their organismic experiencing rather than distorting it. They can therefore trust what they feel because what they feel is no longer defensively distorted. The inner compass points true because it has been recalibrated to actual experience. This makes possible a spontaneity and freedom that rigidly defended persons cannot achieve. The fourth characteristic is experiential freedom, the sense of being the author of one's own life. The fully functioning person experiences themselves as having genuine choice and agency. They are not driven by compulsions, demands of the past, or expectations of others. Though they recognize external constraints, they experience freedom in how they respond to circumstances. This subjective sense of freedom does not require resolution of philosophical debates about determinism. What matters is the felt experience of being self-directed rather than externally controlled. The fifth characteristic is creativity, understood broadly as bringing something new into existence. The fully functioning person approaches life with fresh perception and willingness to experiment. They are not bound by convention or fear of deviation from established patterns. This creativity expresses itself not only in art, but in all domains of living and relating. The person finds novel solutions, sees new possibilities, and engages constructively with challenges. Life itself becomes a creative project rather than a predetermined script to follow. Rogers connected creativity directly to psychological health and openness to experience. Defensiveness blocks creativity by restricting the range of material available for recombination. When significant portions of experience are denied or distorted, creative synthesis becomes limited. openness provides access to more elements that can be combined in original ways. The fully functioning person, therefore, naturally tends toward creative expression and problem-solving. Creativity is not a special gift, but the natural outcome of undistorted psychological functioning. Rogers explicitly stated that the fully functioning person is not a state of adjustment or happiness. Such a person may experience more pain, not less, because they are open to all experience. They do not avoid or numb difficult feelings, but allow them full expression and processing. Life involves inevitable suffering, and full functioning means engaging that suffering authentically. The reward is not constant pleasure, but a deeper sense of living fully and meaningfully. Rogers described this as a more complete kind of living rather than a more comfortable one. The fully functioning person is also characterized by constructive social behavior, Rogers believed. When people operate from their genuine organismic valuing, they tend toward pro-social choices. This follows from his view that humans are fundamentally social beings who need connection. The actualizing tendency, properly expressed, includes actualizing one's relational nature. Destructive behavior emerges from distortion, not from authentic expression of human nature. Remove the distortions, and the natural direction is toward positive relationships and contribution. This aspect of Rogers' vision has drawn the most criticism as potentially naive about human nature. Critics argue that genuinely evil behavior cannot be explained simply as distorted development. Some people seem to authentically value domination, cruelty, or exploitation of others. Rogers would respond that these values represent internalizations from a distorting environment. The truly authentic self, beneath all conditioning, is oriented toward constructive social living. This remains a philosophical commitment about human nature that cannot be definitively proven. The fully functioning person concept influenced later developments in positive psychology. Martin Seligman's work on flourishing and well-being builds on foundations Rogers helped establish. The concept of authentic happiness includes elements Rogers would recognize as full functioning. Self-determination theory's concept of the fully self-determined person clearly echoes Rogers' vision. Though positive psychology sometimes neglects its humanistic roots, the lineage is clear. Rogers was articulating positive mental health decades before positive psychology became a movement. Part 7. The Paradigm Wars: Rogers against Behaviorism and Psychoanalysis. Rogers developed his approach in explicit opposition to the two dominant psychological paradigms of his era. Behaviorism and psychoanalysis controlled academic psychology and clinical practice respectively. Both approaches, despite their vast differences, shared assumptions Rogers rejected fundamentally. Understanding what he opposed clarifies what he proposed as the alternative vision. The contrast illuminates the revolutionary character of his contribution to psychological thought. Rogers was not merely offering another technique, but challenging foundational assumptions about human nature. Behaviorism, associated with John Watson and B.F. Skinner, dominated American academic psychology. It insisted that psychology must study only observable behavior, not internal mental states. Concepts like consciousness, feeling, and experience were rejected as unscientific and unmeasurable. Human behavior was explained entirely through environmental stimuli and reinforcement histories. The person was essentially a complex machine responding to inputs according to conditioning principles. Free will, choice, and self-direction were considered illusions created by our ignorance of causes. Rogers rejected behaviorism's refusal to engage with subjective experience and inner life. For Rogers, the phenomenal field, the world as experienced by the person, was primary. Behavior cannot be understood without reference to the meanings the person attaches to situations. Two people in identical external circumstances may behave entirely differently because they perceive differently. The behaviorist attempt to eliminate subjectivity from psychology was not scientific, but scientistic. It mistook the methods of physics for requirements that all science must follow. Rogers and Skinner engaged in a famous published dialogue in 1956 about the control of human behavior. Skinner advocated for systematic behavioral engineering to improve society and solve human problems. Rogers argued that such control, however benevolent in intention, violated human dignity and freedom. He insisted that persons are self-directing agents, not objects to be manipulated by experts. The debate crystallized fundamental differences about human nature and the proper role of science. Skinner saw Rogers as unscientific. Rogers saw Skinner as dehumanizing in his approach. Rogers did not reject science itself, but behaviorism's narrow conception of what science requires. He insisted that subjective experience could be studied scientifically through appropriate methods. Client reports, empathic understanding, and careful phenomenological description all yield valid data. The demand for external observation and measurement reflected philosophical bias, not scientific necessity. Rogers demonstrated that humanistic approaches could generate testable hypotheses and empirical research. His recorded therapy sessions and outcome studies showed that subjective processes could be investigated. Psychoanalysis, the dominant clinical approach, presented a different but equally problematic framework. Freud had proposed that human behavior is driven by unconscious conflicts and primitive instincts. The unconscious mind contains repressed wishes, primarily sexual and aggressive, that shape all behavior. Insight into these unconscious dynamics, achieved through interpretation, was considered necessary for cure. The analyst possessed expert knowledge that the patient lacked about their own mental life. The therapeutic relationship was hierarchical, with the analyst as authority and patient as object of analysis. Rogers rejected psychoanalysis's pessimistic view of human nature as driven by destructive instincts. He saw no evidence that humans are fundamentally motivated by sexuality and aggression requiring control. The actualizing tendency, not the death instinct, represented the basic motivational force in persons. People move toward growth and health naturally when environmental conditions support this movement. The darker aspects of human behavior reflect distortion of natural tendencies, not their authentic expression. Rogers offered an alternative anthropology that was fundamentally more optimistic about human potential. He also rejected the analyst's claim to know the patient's mind better than the patient knows themselves. Interpretation assumes that the expert can decode unconscious meanings the patient cannot access. Rogers believed this created dependency and undermined the client's own authority over their experience. However accurate an interpretation might be, it comes from outside the client's frame of reference. The client learns to look to the analyst for understanding rather than developing their own insight. This perpetuates rather than resolves the fundamental problem of alienation from one's own experience. The hierarchical structure of psychoanalysis reproduced, Rogers argued, the conditions that caused disturbance. Clients originally became incongruent because authorities told them what they should feel and want. Putting them in another relationship with an authority who interprets their experience repeats the pattern. Healing requires a different kind of relationship that respects the client's authority over their own life. The therapist must step out of the expert role and function as a companion in exploration. This represented a fundamental democratization of the therapeutic relationship and its power dynamics. Rogers acknowledged that psychoanalytic therapy sometimes helps people despite its theoretical framework. He attributed this effectiveness to relationship factors present despite the interpretive methodology. When analysts are warm, empathic and accepting, clients improve regardless of the content of interpretations. The active ingredient is the relationship, not the theoretical understanding or technical interventions. Psychoanalysis works when it does because of elements that contradict its official theory. Rogers essentially argued that psychoanalysis succeeds despite itself, not because of its distinctive methods. Both behaviorism and psychoanalysis shared a deterministic view that Rogers fundamentally opposed. Behaviorism saw behavior as determined by environmental conditioning and reinforcement schedules. Psychoanalysis saw it as determined by unconscious conflicts rooted in early developmental experiences. Neither framework left room for genuine choice, self-direction, or creative freedom. Rogers insisted that persons can transcend their conditioning and become authors of their own lives. This conviction about human freedom and agency distinguished his approach from both dominant paradigms. The humanistic psychology movement emerged partly as organized opposition to these two forces. Rogers, Abraham Maslow and others explicitly positioned humanistic psychology as a third force. They rejected both the mechanism of behaviorism and the pessimism of psychoanalysis. In their place, they offered a vision of humans as creative, growth-oriented, and capable of self-transcendence. Rogers's person-centered approach became the most influential therapeutic expression of this movement. It translated humanistic philosophical commitments into practical clinical methodology. The paradigm conflicts were not merely academic, but had real consequences for how people were treated. Behaviorist approaches could justify manipulating people for their own good without their consent. Psychoanalytic approaches could keep patients in dependent relationships for years or decades. Rogers' approach required respecting client autonomy and trusting their capacity for self-direction. The political implications were significant. His approach implied a more egalitarian social vision. Psychological healing and social democracy were connected in Rogers' thought from the beginning. Part 8. Rogers as scientist, empirical research, and the evidence base. Rogers was not merely a clinician and theorist, but a rigorous researcher committed to empirical validation. He insisted from the beginning that therapeutic claims must be tested against observable evidence. This commitment distinguished him from many humanistic thinkers who disdained scientific methodology. Rogers believed that science and humanism were not opposed, but mutually necessary for progress. His research program pioneered methods for studying therapeutic processes and outcomes systematically. Person-centered therapy became one of the most researched approaches in the history of psychotherapy. Rogers made a revolutionary methodological innovation by recording therapy sessions for analysis. Before him, what happened in therapy remained private and inaccessible to scientific investigation. Therapists reported their impressions, but no one could verify these accounts against actual events. Rogers began systematically recording sessions and transcribing them for detailed examination. This allowed researchers to study what therapists actually did rather than what they claimed to do. It opened the black box of therapy and made therapeutic processes available for empirical study. The recordings revealed significant discrepancies between what therapists believed and what they actually did. Many therapists who claimed to be non-directive were found to subtly direct clients in particular ways. The gap between ideal and actual practice became visible and measurable for the first time. This discovery had important implications for training and for understanding what makes therapy effective. It also demonstrated that scientific methods could illuminate previously inaccessible therapeutic processes. Rogers showed that humanistic concerns could be investigated with empirical rigor. Rogers and his students developed sophisticated rating scales for measuring therapeutic conditions. They created instruments to assess the degree of empathy, regard, and congruence present in sessions. These measures allowed researchers to test whether the conditions actually predicted therapeutic outcomes. The Barrett-Leonard relationship inventory became a standard tool still used in contemporary research. It measures client perceptions of therapist conditions and relates them to therapy outcomes. Decades of research using these instruments have largely supported Rogers' hypotheses. The research consistently shows that perceived empathy predicts positive therapeutic outcomes. Clients who experience their therapists as empathic improve more than those who do not. This finding replicates across different therapeutic orientations, not just person-centered approaches. Even cognitive behavioral therapists who demonstrate higher empathy achieve better outcomes with clients. The relationship appears causal. Experimental studies show that manipulating empathy affects results. Rogers's hypothesis that empathy is necessary for therapeutic change has received substantial support. Unconditional positive regard has also been validated as a predictor of positive outcomes. Clients who feel accepted and valued by their therapists show greater improvement in therapy. The effect appears across different presenting problems and different therapeutic approaches. Judgment and conditional acceptance, by contrast, predict poorer outcomes and earlier dropout. The research suggests that the accepting attitude Rogers described does facilitate therapeutic change. Creating psychological safety through acceptance allows clients to explore difficult material more freely. Congruence research has yielded more complex and sometimes contradictory findings. Some studies support its importance, others find weaker or inconsistent effects. The difficulty partly reflects challenges in measuring therapist genuineness and authenticity. How do you rate whether someone is being their authentic self in a relationship? The concept may be harder to operationalize reliably than empathy or unconditional positive regard. Research continues to investigate how congruence operates and how it can be assessed. Rogers insisted that the relationship factors matter more than specific techniques or interventions. This claim has generated the most important debate in psychotherapy research for decades. The question is whether what therapists do specifically adds anything beyond the relationship itself. Research suggests that relationship factors account for substantial variance in therapy outcomes. Some estimates attribute 30% of improvement to the therapeutic relationship. This significantly exceeds the variance typically attributed to specific therapeutic techniques. However, the sufficiency claim remains contested on empirical grounds. Comparative outcome studies sometimes show advantages for structured approaches with specific disorders. Cognitive behavioral therapy appears more effective than person-centered therapy for some anxiety conditions. Exposure-based treatments for phobias outperform purely relational approaches in controlled studies. These findings suggest that specific interventions add something beyond relationship factors alone. The relationship may be necessary, but perhaps not always sufficient for optimal outcomes. Defenders of Rogers note significant methodological problems with many comparison studies. Person-centered therapy in research protocols often fails to reflect actual practice quality. Therapists designated as person-centered may lack adequate training or commitment to the approach. Studies may compare excellent cognitive behavioral therapy against mediocre person-centered therapy. When relationship conditions are actually provided at high levels, outcomes improve substantially. The question becomes whether fair comparisons have actually been conducted in the research literature. Meta-analyses synthesizing many studies have provided nuanced conclusions about Rogers's hypotheses. The relationship conditions are robustly associated with positive outcomes across therapeutic orientations. They appear necessary in the sense that therapy without them generally fails or harms. Whether they are sufficient remains unclear. The evidence allows different interpretations. Specific interventions may add value for particular problems or particular clients. A both-and conclusion may be more accurate than the either-or framing of the debate. Rogers would likely accept that specific interventions can supplement the core conditions for some clients. He never claimed that person-centered therapy was the only valuable approach to helping people. His claim was that the conditions are necessary, present whenever therapy succeeds, regardless of method. Therapists from any orientation who provide these conditions will be effective. Those who lack them will fail, regardless of how sophisticated their techniques might be. This more modest claim has received substantial and consistent empirical support. Rogers's commitment to research influenced the entire field of psychotherapy research methodology. He demonstrated that therapy could be studied scientifically without abandoning humanistic values. His students went on to develop process research methods still used in contemporary investigation. The emphasis on recorded sessions and systematic rating became standard research practice. Contemporary psychotherapy research owes significant methodological debts to Rogers's pioneering work. He showed that caring about persons and caring about evidence are not incompatible commitments. Part 9. Beyond Therapy: Education, Conflict Resolution and Organizational Applications. Rogers never intended his ideas to remain confined within the therapy room. He recognized early that the principles enabling therapeutic change apply to all human relationships. The same conditions that heal psychological disturbance also promote learning, creativity, and cooperation. He spent the latter decades of his career extending person-centered principles to broader social contexts. Education, organizational leadership, and international conflict resolution all received his systematic attention. This expansion revealed the genuinely radical implications of his seemingly simple therapeutic insights. Rogers's educational philosophy directly challenged conventional classroom practices and assumptions. Traditional education treats students as empty vessels to be filled with knowledge by expert teachers. The teacher knows, the student does not know. Education transfers information from one to the other. Rogers rejected this model as fundamentally disrespectful of the learner's own capacities and motivations. Students are not passive recipients, but active constructors of their own understanding. They learn best when pursuing questions that genuinely matter to them personally. His book, Freedom to Learn, published in 1969, articulated a student-centered approach to education. The teacher's role shifts from information transmitter to facilitator of learning processes. Rather than lecturing and testing, the teacher creates conditions where students direct their own inquiry. The same core conditions operative in therapy apply: genuineness, acceptance, and empathic understanding. Students who feel respected and understood engage more deeply with learning material. Those who feel judged and controlled withdraw into defensive compliance or rebellion. Rogers argued that significant learning involves the whole person, not just the intellect. Purely cognitive learning, disconnected from feeling and personal relevance, remains superficial and forgettable. When learning engages the learner's emotions, values, and sense of self, it transforms them. This kind of learning cannot be forced or imposed. It must be chosen and embraced. The teacher can invite but cannot compel genuine engagement with material. Creating the conditions for self-directed learning is more important than perfecting lecture content. Research on student-centered education has generally supported Rogers' claims about effectiveness. Students in facilitative classrooms show greater initiative, creativity, and depth of understanding. They develop more positive attitudes toward learning and greater capacity for self-direction. Teacher warmth and respect predict student engagement across different educational contexts. The findings parallel therapy research showing that relationship quality predicts positive outcomes. The same conditions that heal also educate, suggesting a common underlying process. Rogers extended his principles to organizational settings and leadership practices. Traditional management assumes that workers must be directed, controlled, and motivated externally. Managers possess expertise. Workers possess labor that must be organized by those who know better. Rogers saw this as the same authoritarian pattern that damages clients and students. It fails to tap the creative potential that exists within every organizational member. A different approach to leadership could release this latent capacity for contribution and growth. Person-centered leadership involves creating conditions where people can do their best work. Leaders who demonstrate genuine respect for team members foster engagement and initiative. Listening carefully to concerns and ideas communicates that contributions are valued. Transparency and honesty from leadership builds trust that enables risk-taking and innovation. These are the same conditions Rogers identified as therapeutic, applied in organizational context. The principles scale from the individual therapeutic relationship to larger social systems. Contemporary organizational psychology has increasingly validated these person-centered insights. Research on psychological safety shows that teams perform better when members feel safe to speak. Transformational leadership, emphasizing inspiration and individual consideration, outperforms authoritarian approaches. Employee engagement correlates with feeling valued, respected, and heard by leadership. These findings echo Rogers' core claims about what humans need to function optimally. The business case for person-centered management has grown stronger over decades. Rogers's most ambitious application addressed international conflict and peace-building. In his final years, he facilitated dialogue between conflicting groups in multiple global hotspots. He worked with Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland during the violent Troubles period. He facilitated encounters between black and white South Africans during apartheid. He organized workshops bringing together representatives from the United States and Soviet Union. He believed that person-centered principles could reduce intergroup hostility and build understanding. The approach to conflict resolution applied familiar person-centered methods to group settings. Participants from opposing sides came together in intensive workshops lasting several days. Facilitators created conditions of safety where each side could express their experience and perspective. The other side was required to listen without immediate rebuttal or defensive response. Gradually, participants began hearing each other as human beings rather than as enemy representatives. Empathy for the other's suffering became possible when defensive hostility could relax. Rogers found that even deeply entrenched enemies could connect when conditions supported authentic encounter. Irish Catholics and Protestants who had lost family members to the other side shared grief together. Black South Africans described experiences of oppression that white participants had never heard directly. Soviet and American participants discovered shared hopes and fears beneath ideological differences. These encounters did not resolve the underlying political conflicts, but changed relationships between participants. Rogers believed that such changed relationships, multiplied across populations, could shift possibilities for peace. Critics questioned whether small group encounters could genuinely affect large-scale political conflicts. The structural causes of conflict remain untouched by interpersonal transformation among individuals. Power imbalances, resource competition, and historical grievances require political, not psychological, solutions. Rogers acknowledged these limitations, but maintained that relationship change is necessary, if not sufficient. Political solutions imposed without transformed relationships tend to break down under renewed hostility. Both structural change and relational healing are required for lasting peace. Rogers was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize shortly before his death in 1987. The nomination arrived days after he died, so he never knew of this recognition. It acknowledged his decades of work applying person-centered principles to violent conflicts. Whether or not his efforts achieved measurable political impact, they demonstrated commitment to his vision. He believed that the same conditions enabling individual healing could enable collective transformation. His life's work extended from helping troubled children to aspiring toward world peace. Part 10. Major critiques, scholarly debates, and Rogers's responses. Rogers's work attracted sustained criticism from multiple directions throughout his career. Understanding these critiques and his responses deepens comprehension of his theory's strengths and limits. The debates reveal genuine tensions and unresolved questions within the person-centered framework. Engaging criticism honestly is essential for any serious intellectual engagement with Rogers' contribution. What follows examines the most significant objections raised by scholars and practitioners. Rogers often responded directly to critics, and his responses illuminate his thinking further. The most fundamental critique concerns Rogers' view of human nature as inherently good. Critics argue this represents naive optimism that ignores the reality of human destructiveness. History provides abundant evidence of cruelty, genocide, and systematic evil perpetrated by humans. How can Rogers maintain that the basic tendency of human beings is toward constructive growth? The objection suggests his theory requires denying or explaining away genuine human malevolence. It accuses him of projecting wishful thinking onto a reality that is far darker. Rollo May, a fellow humanistic psychologist, pressed this critique most forcefully in exchanges with Rogers. May argued that Rogers failed to account for the demonic potential residing within every person. Human beings are capable of deliberate evil, not merely distorted expressions of blocked growth. Ignoring this capacity leaves us unprepared to address the darker dimensions of human existence. May drew on existentialist thought, emphasizing that freedom includes freedom to choose destruction. He saw Rogers as offering a dangerously incomplete picture of human psychological reality. Rogers responded by distinguishing between inherent nature and developed distortion. He never claimed that humans always behave constructively or that evil behavior does not occur. His claim was that destructiveness results from distortion of natural tendencies, not their authentic expression. When the actualizing tendency operates freely without blockage, it moves toward pro-social outcomes. The cruelty we observe represents what happens when development has gone seriously wrong. Remove the distorting conditions, and the underlying constructive tendency reasserts itself. This response shifts the question rather than fully resolving it. Can all destructive behavior genuinely be traced to environmental distortion rather than inherent tendency? Some critics find this explanation strained when applied to systematic evil and calculated cruelty. The debate ultimately involves differing philosophical anthropologies that cannot be settled empirically. Rogers acknowledged that his view of human nature was a working hypothesis, not proven fact. He found it more useful therapeutically and socially than pessimistic alternatives. A second major critique concerns the sufficiency of the therapeutic conditions Rogers specified. Many therapists accept that empathy, regard, and congruence are necessary but not sufficient. They argue that specific techniques and interventions add therapeutic value beyond relationship factors. Cognitive restructuring, behavioral exposure, and skill training appear to produce benefits independently. If the conditions were truly sufficient, these additions would not improve outcomes, but they seem to. This suggests Rogers overstated his case regarding what produces therapeutic change. Rogers acknowledged that other approaches help people, but attributed their effectiveness to relationship factors. When cognitive therapy works, it works because the therapist demonstrates the core conditions. The specific techniques are vehicles for communicating empathy and positive regard. Strip away the relationship, and the techniques lose their therapeutic power. Research partially supports this view. Relationship factors predict outcomes across all orientations. But whether techniques add nothing beyond the relationship remains genuinely contested. Contemporary integrative approaches suggest a more nuanced resolution to this debate. Perhaps both the relationship and specific interventions contribute to therapeutic change. The relationship may be necessary but not always sufficient for optimal outcomes. Certain problems may require specific interventions that relationship alone cannot provide. A both-and perspective may be more accurate than Rogers's either-or framing. His core insight about relationship importance can be preserved without accepting the sufficiency claim. A third critique targets the cultural specificity of Rogers's concepts and practices. His emphasis on individual autonomy, self-direction, and personal growth reflects Western, particularly American values. Many cultures prioritize collective harmony, family obligation, and respect for authority over individual self-actualization. The therapeutic goals Rogers proposed may be culturally inappropriate for clients from these backgrounds. His universalistic claims may actually represent ethnocentric projection of one culture's values. What looks like human nature may be American middle-class nature mistaken for something broader. Research on person-centered therapy across cultures has yielded mixed findings. Some studies show that the core conditions are valued and effective across diverse cultural groups. Empathy and genuine regard may indeed represent universal human needs, not just Western preferences. However, how these conditions are expressed and received varies significantly across cultures. Direct emotional expression valued in Western therapy may be uncomfortable in Asian contexts. The non-directive stance may seem unhelpful to clients expecting expert guidance from professionals. Rogers himself acknowledged the need for cultural sensitivity and adaptation in later writings. He recognized that his theory developed within a particular cultural context with particular assumptions. The specific practices might require modification while preserving the underlying principles. Empathy means entering the client's frame of reference, which includes their cultural worldview. A truly person-centered approach must respect cultural values even when they differ from the therapist's. The self-critique suggests Rogers was more aware of these issues than critics sometimes acknowledge. A fourth critique questions whether Rogers' approach works for severe psychopathology. His theory developed largely from work with relatively well-functioning neurotic clients. Can person-centered therapy effectively treat psychosis, severe personality disorders, or trauma? Some argue that these conditions require more structured, directive, and technically sophisticated interventions. The non-directive stance may leave severely disturbed clients without the guidance they need. Rogers may have generalized inappropriately from his experience with less disturbed populations. Rogers himself worked with schizophrenic patients and published research on these efforts. The Wisconsin Schizophrenia Project in the early 1960s tested person-centered therapy with psychotic clients. Results were mixed and did not clearly demonstrate effectiveness with this population. Rogers interpreted the findings as showing that the conditions help when they can be perceived by clients. Severely psychotic individuals may be too disconnected to perceive and use the therapeutic relationship. This suggests limits to the approach rather than its complete failure with severe pathology. Subsequent practitioners have developed modifications for working with more disturbed populations. Gary Prouty's pre-therapy approach addresses clients too impaired for standard person-centered work. It focuses on establishing basic psychological contact before the other conditions become relevant. Trauma-informed adaptations integrate person-centered principles with specific trauma interventions. These developments suggest that Rogers' framework can be extended but may require supplementation. The core conditions remain necessary but may need additional elements for certain presentations. Part 11. Legacy and Influence. Self-determination theory, motivational interviewing, positive psychology. Rogers' influence extends far beyond the therapeutic approach that bears his name. His ideas permeate contemporary psychology, often without explicit acknowledgement of their source. Several major contemporary frameworks directly continue and develop his foundational insights. Tracing these lineages reveals how deeply his thinking has shaped current psychological understanding. The influence operates both through direct intellectual descent and through broader cultural absorption. Many therapists and researchers apply Rogerian principles without knowing they are doing so. Self-determination theory, developed by Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, represents the most direct continuation. This comprehensive framework for understanding human motivation explicitly builds on humanistic foundations. Deci and Ryan acknowledge Rogers' influence on their conception of innate growth tendencies. Their theory proposes that humans have basic psychological needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. When these needs are satisfied, people naturally move toward growth and well-being. When they are thwarted, psychological dysfunction and diminished motivation result. The parallel with Rogers' actualizing tendency and conditions of worth is unmistakable. Both theories propose that humans naturally develop well when environmental conditions support this development. Both locate the cause of dysfunction in environments that block or distort natural growth processes. Both emphasize the critical importance of relationships that support autonomy rather than control. Self-determination theory essentially provides empirical specification and testing of Rogerian principles. It translates humanistic philosophy into measurable constructs amenable to experimental investigation. Self-determination theory has generated an enormous body of research supporting its core claims. Studies across domains including education, work, health, and sports confirm the need satisfaction model. Autonomy-supportive environments produce better outcomes than controlling ones across diverse contexts. The research validates Rogers' intuition that respecting human agency facilitates positive development. What Rogers articulated through clinical observation, Desai and Ryan demonstrated through controlled experimentation. The convergence strengthens confidence in the underlying principles both approaches share. Motivational interviewing, developed by William Miller and Stephen Rolnick, represents another important legacy. This approach to facilitating behavior change explicitly draws on person-centered principles. It emphasizes empathic listening, acceptance, and supporting client autonomy in making decisions. The therapist avoids confrontation and instead evokes the client's own motivation for change. The approach has proven remarkably effective for addiction treatment and health behavior change. It demonstrates that Rogers' conditions can be applied systematically to specific clinical problems. Motivational interviewing addresses a limitation some found in traditional person-centered therapy. Rogers was criticized for offering no clear direction when clients needed help changing specific behaviors. Motivational interviewing maintains the person-centered relationship stance while adding strategic elements. The therapist still respects client autonomy, but also deliberately evokes and strengthens change talk. This integration preserves what is essential in Rogers, while addressing practical clinical needs. It shows how person-centered principles can evolve and adapt without losing their core character. Positive psychology, the contemporary movement focused on human flourishing, also descends from Rogers. Martin Seligman, who founded the movement, initially distanced it from humanistic psychology. He criticized humanistic approaches as lacking empirical rigor and scientific respectability. Yet the content of positive psychology clearly echoes themes Rogers articulated decades earlier. The focus on strengths, growth, meaning, and positive relationships reprises humanistic concerns. Positive psychology essentially repackaged humanistic content in more scientifically acceptable form. Over time, the connection between positive psychology and humanistic psychology has been increasingly acknowledged. Scholars have documented the substantial overlap in concerns, concepts, and assumptions. Rogers's fully functioning person clearly anticipates Seligman's concept of authentic happiness and flourishing. The emphasis on conditions that support optimal human development is common to both frameworks. Positive psychology has perhaps extended empirical investigation further than humanistic psychology achieved. But the intellectual debt to Rogers and other humanistic pioneers is now more openly recognized. The therapeutic relationship research tradition directly continues Rogers's pioneering empirical work. Contemporary studies on what makes therapy effective consistently highlight relationship factors. Empathy, positive regard, and alliance quality predict outcomes across all therapeutic orientations. This finding, replicated in hundreds of studies, validates Rogers's central claim about therapeutic change. The relationship matters more than the specific techniques employed, just as Rogers argued. His insistence on researching therapy processes has shaped how the entire field investigates effectiveness. Rogers' influence extends beyond psychology into education, management, and healthcare. Student-centered learning has become a mainstream educational approach, particularly at progressive institutions. Patient-centered care has transformed healthcare delivery and become a quality standard in medicine. Person-centered leadership concepts appear in management literature, often without crediting Rogers. The language of empathy, acceptance, and genuine presence pervades contemporary helping professions. Rogers' vocabulary has become so normalized that its revolutionary origins are often forgotten. A survey in 2006 found that Rogers was rated the most influential psychotherapist in history. He ranked above Freud, Beck, and all other figures in terms of perceived impact on the field. This finding surprised some, given the criticism that person-centered therapy is outdated or insufficient. But it reflects how thoroughly his insights have been absorbed into mainstream therapeutic practice. What was once radical has become accepted as basic good practice for any therapeutic approach. His revolution succeeded so completely that it no longer appears revolutionary. Part 12. Common misconceptions and what Rogers actually meant. Rogers' ideas have been widely disseminated but frequently misunderstood in the process. Popular presentations often reduce his sophisticated theory to simplistic caricatures. These misconceptions distort his actual views and undermine the effectiveness of those who apply them. Clarifying what Rogers actually meant is essential for anyone seeking to understand or use his approach. What follows addresses the most common and consequential misunderstandings of his work. Each misconception reveals something important about what person-centered practice truly requires. The first misconception is that person-centered therapy means simply being nice to clients. This trivializes the profound demands of genuine empathy, unconditional regard, and congruence. Many people can be pleasant and supportive without providing the specific conditions Rogers described. Friendliness is not the same as the disciplined attentiveness and self-awareness Rogers required. Therapeutic empathy involves rigorous, continuous effort to perceive from within the client's frame. It is far more demanding than ordinary social kindness or everyday expressions of sympathy. Rogers himself complained about this misunderstanding throughout his career. He observed therapists who thought they were being person-centered while actually providing superficial support. They smiled, nodded, and said encouraging things without genuinely understanding the client's experience. This warm fuzziness fails to provide what clients actually need for therapeutic change. Person-centered therapy requires precise, accurate perception of the client's inner world. Being nice is easy. Being genuinely empathic is extraordinarily difficult and requires extensive training. The second misconception is that person-centered therapists merely reflect back what clients say. This reduces the approach to a mechanical technique of parroting client statements. Parody versions show therapists simply restating everything the client says in slightly different words. Real person-centered practice involves far more than verbal reflection or paraphrasing. The therapist is actively working to understand meanings, often unstated, beneath the client's words. Reflection, when done well, offers something back that deepens the client's self-understanding. Rogers actually moved away from emphasizing reflection as a technique later in his career. He recognized that focusing on technique missed the point about therapeutic attitudes. The attitudes of empathy, regard, and congruence can be communicated in many different ways. Reflection is one vehicle, but not the only or even the primary one. What matters is that the client feels genuinely understood, not that specific verbal forms are employed. Skilled person-centered therapists use whatever responses best communicate their understanding. The third misconception is that person-centered therapists are passive and never direct or challenge. Critics describe the approach as merely sitting back and letting clients ramble aimlessly. This misses the active, engaged quality of genuine person-centered presence. The therapist is intensely involved, tracking the client's experience with focused attention. They may offer reflections that sharpen awareness or notice contradictions the client has missed. Non-directiveness refers to not imposing the therapist's agenda, not to passivity or disengagement. Rogers was clear that the therapist is genuinely present as a person in the relationship. Congruence means the therapist can share their own reactions when this serves the client's process. A therapist who notices frustration with a client might authentically share this observation. The sharing is done in service of the relationship and the client's growth, not therapist venting. This kind of intervention can be quite direct while remaining fundamentally person-centered. The criterion is whether it respects the client's authority and serves their development. The fourth misconception is that unconditional positive regard means approving of everything. This confuses acceptance of the person with endorsement of their behaviors or beliefs. A therapist can fully accept a client while having serious concerns about what they are doing. The acceptance is of the client's fundamental worth and right to be treated with dignity. It does not extend to validating harmful actions or pretending problematic behaviors are fine. The person is valued unconditionally. Specific behaviors can still be honestly addressed. Rogers made this distinction carefully in his theoretical writings, but it is often overlooked. He spoke of prizing the client as a person separate from evaluating their particular actions. This allows the therapist to maintain acceptance while still engaging honestly with difficult material. A client discussing abusive behavior toward others can be accepted as a person worth helping. Simultaneously, the therapist does not pretend the behavior is acceptable or without consequences. The skill lies in holding both acceptance of the person and honest engagement with their actions. The fifth misconception is that Rogers believed all problems would resolve if people just expressed feelings. This reduces his approach to emotional ventilation without integration or deeper change. Simply expressing feelings without the therapeutic conditions produces limited benefit. What matters is experiencing feelings fully within a relationship that provides new conditions. The client receives acceptance for experiences that were previously met with rejection or judgment. This allows reorganization of the self-concept to include previously denied aspects of experience. The process Rogers described involves much more than cathartic emotional release. It includes gradual symbolization in awareness of experiences that had been distorted or denied. The client develops new ways of perceiving themselves and their relationship to their experience. This cognitive affective reorganization produces lasting change in personality structure. Mere expression without this deeper processing would leave the person essentially unchanged. Rogers was describing personality transformation, not just feeling better through venting. The sixth misconception is that person-centered therapy works for everyone in all circumstances. Rogers's own statements about necessary and sufficient conditions contributed to this absolutism. In reality, the approach works better for some clients and some problems than for others. Clients who prefer structure, direction, or concrete advice may find it frustrating and unhelpful. Certain conditions, like specific phobias, may respond better to more directive interventions. Person-centered therapy is a powerful approach, but not a universal solution for all human suffering. Part 13. Neuroscience, Biology, and Modern Scientific Connections. Rogers developed his theory before contemporary neuroscience tools became available. He worked from clinical observation, phenomenological description, and psychological research. The question arises whether modern neuroscience supports, contradicts, or refines his theoretical claims. Examining these connections illuminates the biological foundations beneath his psychological concepts. The convergence between his insights and current neuroscience is often striking. He appears to have described psychological processes that have identifiable neural correlates. The actualizing tendency finds support in research on self-organizing systems and brain plasticity. Brains spontaneously generate coherent patterns of activity without requiring external direction. Neural development follows intrinsic programs that unfold given adequate environmental support. The brain continuously reorganizes itself in response to experience throughout the lifespan. This neuroplasticity demonstrates the biological capacity for growth and change Rogers posited. The organism does tend toward increased organization and complexity, as he claimed. Research on the default mode network provides neurobiological perspective on self-related processing. This network of brain regions activates during rest and self-referential thinking. It appears involved in constructing and maintaining the narrative sense of self Rogers described. The self-concept may have identifiable neural substrates in default mode network function. Dysfunction in this network correlates with various psychological disorders involving self-disturbance. Rogers' psychological description of the self may map onto this neural architecture. Studies on self-actualized individuals reveal distinctive patterns of brain connectivity. People scoring high on measures related to flourishing show greater integration across brain regions. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for integration and executive function, shows enhanced activity. Greater connectivity between default mode and executive networks predicts well-being measures. This suggests that psychological integration corresponds to neural integration, as Rogers might predict. The fully functioning person may have a measurably more integrated brain. Empathy research has identified distinct neural systems underlying different empathic processes. Effective empathy involves regions associated with emotional processing and resonance. Cognitive empathy engages systems for perspective-taking and mental state inference. Rogers' empathy appears to require coordinated activation of both systems working together. The therapist must both feel with the client and understand their cognitive emotional structure. Neuroscience validates that this integration is both real and measurable in brain activity. The neuroscience of attachment provides biological grounding for Rogers's developmental claims. Secure attachment in infancy produces measurable differences in brain structure and function. The stress response system calibrates differently based on early relational experience. Children who receive consistent responsive care develop better regulated nervous systems. This biological embedding of relational experience supports Rogers's emphasis on conditions of worth. Early relationships literally shape the brain's capacity for emotional regulation and relationship. Research by Antonio Damasio on emotion and consciousness parallels Rogers's views in striking ways. Damasio argues that feelings provide essential information for adaptive decision-making. Patients with damage to emotion processing regions make poor decisions despite intact reasoning. This supports Rogers' concept of organismic valuing as a source of wisdom about what enhances life. The body's felt sense provides information that purely cognitive processing cannot access. Disconnection from this felt sense, as in incongruence, impairs adaptive functioning. The polyvagal theory, developed by Stephen Porges, offers a neurobiological model of safety and connection. It describes how the autonomic nervous system responds to perceived safety or threat in relationships. When people feel safe, their social engagement system activates, enabling connection and openness. When threatened, defensive systems mobilize that inhibit relational engagement and exploration. This provides biological explanation for why Rogers' conditions facilitate therapeutic change. Creating safety through acceptance and empathy shifts the nervous system toward openness. Porges' work suggests that the therapeutic relationship operates partly through nervous system regulation. The therapist's calm, accepting presence communicates safety at a physiological level. This co-regulation allows the client's defensive system to relax and permit exploration. The mechanism is not purely psychological, but involves actual shifts in autonomic functioning. Rogers intuited what neuroscience now demonstrates. Relationships change biology, not just thoughts. The conditions he described may work partly by shifting the client's physiological state. Interpersonal neurobiology, developed by Daniel Siegel, synthesizes these various threads. Siegel proposes that minds develop through relationships, and that integration is the core of health. Well-being involves integration across different brain systems and between people in relationships. Dysfunction reflects blocked integration, either intrapsychic or interpersonal. This framework aligns remarkably with Rogers's theory of incongruence and therapeutic change. Siegel explicitly acknowledges humanistic psychology's contribution to his interpersonal neurobiology. The convergence between Rogers and contemporary neuroscience is not complete or without tension. Neuroscience tends toward reductionist explanation that might concern humanistic psychologists. Reducing empathy to mirror neurons or therapy to nervous system regulation misses something essential. The lived experience of the therapeutic encounter cannot be fully captured in neural correlates. Rogers would likely welcome biological validation while insisting on the primacy of subjective experience. The phenomenological and neurobiological perspectives complement rather than replace each other. Part 14. Limitations, boundary cases, and cross-cultural considerations. Every theoretical framework has limits, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging them. Rogers' approach, despite its strengths, faces genuine boundaries in application and validity. Understanding these limitations enables more effective and appropriate use of person-centered principles. It also identifies areas requiring further development, integration, or alternative approaches. What follows examines the most significant limitations without dismissing what the approach genuinely offers. Mature engagement with any theory requires clear-eyed recognition of both strengths and weaknesses. The first significant limitation concerns severe and persistent mental illness. Rogers developed his approach primarily with clients experiencing neurotic difficulties and adjustment problems. These individuals retained sufficient contact with reality to perceive and use the therapeutic relationship. Clients experiencing acute psychosis, severe dissociation, or profound cognitive impairment present different challenges. They may be unable to perceive the empathy and acceptance the therapist offers. Without this perception, the therapeutic conditions cannot have their intended effect. Rogers's own research with schizophrenic patients produced ambiguous results. Some clients improved, but the approach did not demonstrate clear superiority to other treatments. The conditions may be necessary but not sufficient for this population. Additional interventions, including medication and structured rehabilitation, may be required. Person-centered principles can inform how these interventions are delivered without replacing them. The approach may need supplementation rather than abandonment for severe conditions. The second limitation involves clients who need specific information, skills, or directive guidance. Some problems respond better to expert instruction than to exploratory self-discovery. A client who needs to learn anxiety management techniques may benefit from direct teaching. Someone facing a concrete decision may need information the therapist possesses and they lack. Withholding useful guidance in the name of non-directiveness can constitute a failure of care. Rigid adherence to non-directive principles may sometimes disserve client needs. This limitation has led many practitioners toward integrative approaches. They maintain person-centered relationship attitudes while adding directive elements when appropriate. The therapist can provide information, teach skills, or offer suggestions within an accepting relationship. What matters is that the client remains the authority on their own life and choices. The integration allows flexibility in meeting diverse client needs without abandoning core principles. Pure, person-centered therapy may be one option among several a therapist can offer. The third limitation concerns crisis situations requiring immediate intervention. A client in acute suicidal crisis may need more than empathic understanding in the moment. Safety assessment means restriction, and potentially involuntary hospitalization may be necessary. The person-centered stance of respecting client autonomy faces hard limits with imminent danger. The therapist must sometimes act directively to preserve life even against client wishes. This creates genuine tension with person-centered philosophy that cannot be easily resolved. Rogers acknowledged that respecting autonomy has limits when safety is at stake. He believed these situations are rarer than often assumed, and that relationship usually suffices. A client who feels genuinely understood and accepted often steps back from self-destructive action. Empathy may be the most effective suicide prevention intervention in many circumstances. But not all circumstances, and practitioners must recognize when other responses are necessary. Person-centered principles inform, but do not absolutely determine crisis response. The fourth limitation involves cultural contexts that do not share Western individualist assumptions. Rogers' approach emphasizes individual self-direction, personal autonomy, and self-actualization. Many cultures prioritize collective well-being, family obligation, and social role fulfillment. The therapeutic goal of self-actualization may not resonate with clients from these backgrounds. Imposing individualist values in the name of being person-centered contradicts the approach's own principles. True respect for the person includes respecting their cultural values and worldview. Research on cross-cultural application has produced nuanced findings. The core conditions of empathy and acceptance appear valued across diverse cultural groups. People everywhere seem to appreciate being genuinely heard and accepted without judgment. However, how these conditions are expressed and received varies significantly across cultures. Direct emotional expression may be uncomfortable where emotional restraint is valued. Non-directive approaches may seem unhelpful where expert guidance is expected and respected. Adapting person-centered practice for different cultural contexts requires genuine cultural humility. The therapist must learn about the client's cultural values and how they shape expectations. Empathy means understanding the client within their cultural frame of reference, not the therapist's. What constitutes respectful behavior, appropriate boundaries, and therapeutic goals varies culturally. The person-centered practitioner must be flexible enough to adapt while maintaining core principles. This cultural responsiveness represents ongoing work, rather than a completed achievement. The fifth limitation concerns the theory's vagueness about specific change mechanisms. Rogers described conditions that facilitate change, but was less clear about how change actually occurs. What exactly happens psychologically when someone experiences empathy and begins to change? The theory offers descriptions of outcomes, but less specification of underlying processes. This vagueness makes it difficult to know precisely what is working or why. More mechanistic theories, despite their limitations, offer clearer explanations of change processes. Contemporary developments have begun addressing this limitation through process research. Studies examine moment-to-moment changes in therapy sessions and what predicts movement. Research on experiencing levels tracks how deeply clients engage with their felt experience. Emotional processing research specifies what kinds of emotional work produce therapeutic change. These refinements begin filling in the black box of how person-centered conditions produce their effects. The theory continues to develop beyond Rogers' original formulations. Acknowledging limitations does not diminish the genuine contributions of Rogers' approach. Every framework has boundaries. The question is whether its strengths justify its use within those limits. Person-centered principles remain foundational for effective therapy regardless of orientation. Even practitioners using other approaches benefit from relationship attitudes, Rogers articulated. The limitations identify areas for continued development, not reasons for wholesale rejection. Rogers himself would likely welcome this critical engagement as consistent with scientific progress. Part 15. Conclusion: The Quiet Revolution and its Unfinished Work. Carl Rogers accomplished something rare in the history of ideas. He proposed a fundamental reorientation in how we understand human beings and helping relationships. This reorientation has been so thoroughly absorbed that its revolutionary character is now invisible. What once seemed radical now appears as obvious common sense in therapeutic practice. The transformation of the obvious marks the success of his quiet revolution. We have forgotten what therapy looked like before Rogers changed it. Before Rogers, therapists positioned themselves as experts who diagnosed and treated passive patients. The professional possessed knowledge the patient lacked about their own psychological functioning. Treatment meant applying this expert knowledge to fix what was broken in the patient's psyche. The relationship was hierarchical, with authority flowing from professional to recipient of services. Rogers systematically dismantled this framework and proposed an alternative built on different premises. The client knows themselves better than any expert. The therapist's role is to facilitate, not direct. This shift carried implications far beyond technique or methodology. It challenged assumptions about knowledge, authority, and human nature embedded in Western professional practice. If the client is the expert on their own life, what is the professional's legitimate role? If people naturally tend toward growth, why do we need elaborate interventions to fix them? Rogers' answers to these questions distributed power differently than traditional arrangements. His approach was democratizing, egalitarian, and implicitly political in its consequences. Richard Farson aptly described Rogers as a quiet revolutionary. He did not march in protests or issue manifestos calling for radical social transformation. Instead, he sat in rooms with troubled people and treated them with profound respect. He listened carefully, accepted fully, and trusted that they could find their own way forward. This simple practice, multiplied across thousands of therapeutic encounters, changed things. The revolution happened one relationship at a time, quietly transforming expectations and possibilities. The revolution remains unfinished because its implications have not been fully realized. Much of professional practice still operates on assumptions Rogers challenged. Experts still claim to know better than the people they serve about what those people need. Institutions still treat individuals as objects to be processed rather than persons to be respected. The conditions Rogers identified as necessary for growth remain scarce in families, schools, and organizations. His vision of a more humane social environment has been partially realized at best. Rogers himself recognized that individual therapy was insufficient to address systemic problems. You can help one person at a time, but the environment keeps producing new casualties. His later work extending person-centered principles to education and organizations addressed this recognition. He hoped that transforming institutions could prevent the damage that therapy then had to repair. Schools that respected students would produce fewer wounded adults needing therapeutic help. Organizations that valued workers would create fewer sites of alienation and dehumanization. This systemic vision remains largely unrealized despite the success of his therapeutic innovations. Schools still predominantly function as systems of external control and standardized evaluation. Workplaces still largely treat employees as means to organizational ends rather than as persons. Healthcare systems still often process patients as cases rather than encountering them as individuals. The structures that damage people remain intact, even as therapy helps individuals cope with the damage. Rogers pointed towards something larger than therapy could achieve on its own. Contemporary psychology has absorbed Rogers' insights, but sometimes without fully understanding them. The therapeutic relationship is acknowledged as important, but then technique is emphasized anyway. Empathy is valued in principle, but training focuses on protocols and procedures. Person-centered language pervades professional discourse, while person-centered practice remains difficult. The words have been adopted. The deep transformation of practice continues to be a challenge. There is distance between what we say we value and how we actually behave. What would it mean to take Rogers' insights fully seriously? It would mean organizing helping relationships around trust in the person seeking help. It would mean providing the conditions for growth rather than imposing external standards and solutions. It would mean respecting autonomy even when we think we know better than the person themselves. It would mean being genuinely present as a person rather than hiding behind professional roles. These demands are simple to state and extraordinarily difficult to actually fulfill. Rogers spent his life trying to be the kind of person who could provide these conditions. By all accounts, he largely succeeded in embodying the values his theory articulated. He listened attentively, accepted genuinely, and treated people with consistent respect and warmth. His own development exemplified the process of becoming more fully functioning he described. He did not merely theorize about human growth, he demonstrated it in how he lived. The congruence between his ideas and his person gave his work its persuasive power. His final years were spent working for peace in places torn by violent conflict. He brought the same principles to Belfast and Moscow that he had developed in therapy rooms. He believed that what heals individuals could also heal communities and nations divided by hatred. Whether this hope was realistic or idealistic remains uncertain. The conflicts he addressed continue, though some of the individuals he touched were changed. Perhaps that is all we can do. Change things one person, one relationship, one encounter at a time. Rogers died in 1987, but his influence continues to unfold and develop. New generations of researchers, practitioners and thinkers engage with his ideas and extend them. The person-centered approach evolves, adapts and responds to new knowledge and new challenges. His work was never meant to be a finished system, but an ongoing process of inquiry and practice. The best tribute to Rogers is not to repeat what he said, but to continue what he started. The quiet revolution continues wherever people meet each other with genuine understanding and acceptance. In the end, Rogers' message was simple, though its implications are vast. People flourish when they are truly heard, genuinely accepted, and met with authentic presence. This is not a complicated idea, but it is extraordinarily difficult to practice consistently. It requires setting aside our agendas, suspending our judgments, and being fully present to another. When we manage this, something healing happens that no technique can manufacture. The actualizing tendency, temporarily blocked, begins flowing again toward growth and life. Rogers trusted this tendency because he had witnessed it repeatedly in his clinical work. Person after person, given the right conditions, moved toward greater wholeness and health. The evidence convinced him that human nature, at its core, bends toward the light. This trust was not naive optimism, but hard-won conviction based on decades of observation. He saw what people could become when freed from the conditions that had constrained them. That vision of human possibility remains his most enduring gift to those who followed.